Coming up, the Knicks knock off the Sixers and the Cavs get a big road win in Indy. This is Locked On Game to Game NBA.
Every game, every team, every angle. Locked On Game to Game, your team every day.
Welcome in, everyone, to Locked On Game to Game NBA, local experts going over the biggest stories on the hardwood. I'm your host, Jourdan Black. Thank you so much for making Locked On your first listen every single weekday. The Magic overcame a 33-point night from LaMelo Ball and beat the Hornets in Charlotte yesterday afternoon. Our Locked On Magic host tells us how it all went down.
The Orlando Magic are heading home with a 3-1 road trip after they defeat the Charlotte Hornets on Sunday afternoon. Look, this wasn't a pretty game. It wasn't a game that a lot of people expect. When you're facing a team like the Charlotte Hornets, yes, they're at the bottom of the standings. There are not many teams that come away expecting more than a blowout win. And while Orlando didn't necessarily put this game far out of reach, they came back from an early deficit, they controlled the tempo of the game, and they won the game. And that's a big thing for a young team, is even when they don't have their best stuff, even with Paolo Banchero and Franz Wagner struggling to shoot, this team is finding ways to continue to win. This team is finding ways to keep building, keep growing, and keep adding to that win total. And to me, that's a big sign of this team's maturity. We've been wanting to see this team be more consistent. We've been wanting to see this team put things together. And these are the kind of wins that show they are indeed putting a lot of things together. And that's why the Magic are winning games. That's why the Magic have already matched last season's win total, and that's why the Magic are heading home from this road trip very, very happy.
The Cavs went on the road and blew out the Pacers in Indianapolis Sunday with Darius Garland leading the way. Locked On Cavs recaps the big win for Cleveland.
What's up? Chris Manning here from the Locked On Cavs podcast, coming to you after the Cavs took care of business against the Indiana Pacers on Sunday night. Two big players stood out for Cleveland in this one. Evan Mobley's first up, 17-10 for him. He was utterly dominant inside in this game. The Cavs as a whole held the Pacers to 14% below league average shooting at the rim. Mobley, along with Jarrett Allen, were a big reason why. And then there was Isaac Okoro, who is having a breakout run of play right now. 20 points for Okoro, 3 of 4 from 3, 3 assists, 7 of 9 from the field overall. He's playing with confidence. He is playing like the 3-and-D, stout point of attack defense wing Cleveland hoped they were getting out of Auburn when they got him in the draft. This is the best basketball he has played in his NBA career, and it kind of has solidified their starting 3 spot if he continues to play like this. For more, check out Locked On Cavs wherever you get your podcasts.
Julius Randle looked good again for the Knicks as they upset the Sixers in Madison Square Garden last night. Locked On Knicks tells us how New York pulled off the win.
The New York Knicks beat the Philadelphia 76ers 108-97, and all the usual heroes showed up. You had Jalen Brunson, Julius Randle, and Evan Fournier and Deuce McBride. Okay, maybe not all the usual heroes showed up. Alex Wolf from Locked On Knicks here, and yeah, give credit to Evan Fournier. Guy had 17 points off the bench with RJ Barrett out with an illness. So he stayed prepared, even though he's had an iffy season so far. Deuce McBride, 14 points off the bench and an absurd plus 34 plus minus in 22 minutes on the court. Just absolute insanity, the impact that he had on this one. And the Knicks pulled out the win. So big ups to Deuce and Evan Fournier, and a huge fun win for the Knicks against one of the East's best. I'll have more on Locked On Knicks.
Coming up, the Pelicans and Timberwolves win in blowout fashion. This is Locked On Game to Game NBA. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. How does it work, you ask? You pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win 25 times your money on any entry. No competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. PrizePicks offers projections on any sport that you watch and love: NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, college football, college basketball, the WNBA, esports, NASCAR, you name it, they've got it. So download the PrizePicks app, or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. So if you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, PrizePicks will give you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Welcome back to Locked On Game to Game NBA. I'm your host, Jourdan Black. Thank you so much for making Locked On your first listen every day. Scotty Barnes and Pascal Siakam came up big in the final minutes for Toronto as the Raptors beat the Grizzlies in Memphis Sunday. After just the fifth Memphis loss at home all season, the Locked On hosts from both teams tell us how Toronto found a way to get the dub.
One last win for old time's sake. Sean Woodley here from Locked On Raptors to break down the Toronto Raptors 106-103 win over the Ja Morant, Steven Adams, Dillon Brooks-less Memphis Grizzlies on Sunday. A win that pushes the Raptors to 4-3 on the 7-game Western road trip that was meant to determine whether they're going to be buyers or sellers at the deadline. And though they went 4-3, the quality of wins on the trip against Portland, a not very good Blazers team, against the Rockets in pretty uninspiring fashion on Friday, and then against a shorthanded Grizzlies team by just 3 points on Sunday, suggests that this Raptors team is probably on the verge of at least having something happen to it trade-wise. And the two guys who I think everyone kind of has their eyes on right now are Fred VanVleet and Pascal Siakam. Siakam not so much because he's going to get dealt. I'd be very surprised if that happened. But Fred VanVleet and Siakam have been teammates on the Raptors since 2016 when they were prized jewels of the Raptors' incredible 2016 draft class that featured Jakob Poeltl as well as Siakam in the first round and Fred VanVleet as an undrafted free agent. There's a very real possibility this is the last time we will see those two play together, which is a pretty somber realization for a Raptors team that is very much disappointed this season. Unsure still if Fred VanVleet's going to be dealt, but with the Kyrie Irving trade to the Mavericks, there's surely a few teams, the Clippers included, who are still looking for point guards who could very much turn their attention towards VanVleet before Thursday. The Raptors don't play again until Wednesday against the San Antonio Spurs. We could still see the Siakam-VanVleet duo play one more time, and they could still stick together through the deadline. But if this was the last time for those two, at least it came in a winning effort, and the game came with a glimpse of the future as well, as Scotty Barnes finished this game off with two big makes down the stretch, as well as a stop on Jaren Jackson Jr. on his attempt to tie the game at the buzzer. I'll have more broken down on this game on tomorrow's episode of Locked On Raptors. Be sure to tune in.
The Memphis Grizzlies have lost 7 of their last 8 basketball games, and that's a pretty sizable and noticeable trend for a team that was one of the hottest in the league. All of a sudden, they're one of the coldest, and there's plenty of blame to go around. I am Joe Mullinax of Locked On Grizzlies, and no Ja Morant, no Dillon Brooks, no Steven Adams. Context is important, and without 3 starters, the Grizzlies were always likely to struggle, but that excuse does not explain how Memphis once again had a terrible end of the game. A double-digit win for the Toronto Raptors in the fourth quarter leads to Memphis giving up another major lead late. Limited Desmond Bane shots in the second half when he was doing extremely well in the first half. Lots of blame to go around. Interesting rotation choices, interesting guys closing out the game in offensive sets. There are lots of questions for this Memphis Grizzlies team entering trade deadline week.
The Timberwolves dominated the Nuggets in Minnesota last night. Our Locked On Wolves host has more on how his team took over.
The Minnesota Timberwolves notched an easy win over the Denver Nuggets on Sunday night in a game that was more about who didn't play for Denver and who returned for the Wolves than anything else. I'm Ben Beacon, host of the Locked On Wolves podcast, and Denver didn't bring 4 of their 5 starters to the game. No Nikola Jokic, no Jamal Murray, no Aaron Gordon, and no Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. The Wolves got Jordan McLaughlin back after a 30-game absence from injury. He hasn't played since the end of November. And the Timberwolves led this one wire to wire. They led by double figures after the first quarter. They were up by 18 at halftime. They extended the lead, 20 at halftime. They extended the lead to 23 before the fourth quarter and put this thing away very, very early. It was a well-balanced offensive attack. The Wolves scored 128 points, and nobody had more than 20 in this game. DeAngelo Russell had 18 and 10 for a double-double. Ant led the team with 20 points. Jalen Noel had 16 off the bench. And again, just an overall well-rounded win for the Wolves. And we'll talk all about it on the post-game podcast. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Wolves for all things Timberwolves.
New Orleans also won in a blowout at home against the Kings. Our Locked On Pelicans host recaps the career night for Trey Murphy that helped lead to the New Orleans victory.
The Pelicans are back to winning ways, and now do they look to make a big splash at the NBA's trade deadline? I'm Jake Madison, host of Locked On Pelicans and Locked On NBA. During the Pelicans' 10-game losing streak, you repeatedly heard me say the team would be fine, that I wasn't panicking, and the Pelicans showed you why over the weekend. In a huge win over the Los Angeles Lakers Saturday night, Brandon Ingram showed you he was back after scoring 35 points. He just needs a little bit of time after nearly 2 months off. Then, on the second night of a back-to-back without Brandon Ingram, the Pelicans showed off their depth. 30 points for Trey Murphy, who went 6 of 8 from 3. Billy Hernangomez scored 22 points. Larry Nance Jr. shut down all-star Domantas Sabonis. And now with the ship feeling a little bit righted, can the Pelicans be a top team in the West and a title contender? If they make a big move at the deadline, that is the front office and ownership saying yes to that question. Let's see what happens up to Thursday.
And that's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Game to Game. Thanks again for making Locked On your first listen every single weekday. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On NBA and to your team's Locked On podcast on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast. I'm Jourdan Black, and this has been Locked On Game to Game NBA.